It is high noon in Central Park in New York City. I'm standing in direct sunlight. It's harsh and miserable, and guess what? It's not the place that you want to be shooting your portrait images. But today, I'm going to show you how to take control of midday light. This by no means is the type of light you want for a portrait. I have really bright highlights on my face and really dark shadows. It isn't flattering. So what I'm going to teach you how to do is how to take diffusers to diffuse the light, reflectors to fill in the light, and a variety of other tools that you have to take control and conquer midday light. Right now I'm in Central Park at the beautiful Belvedere Castle, and you may hear a little bit of Shakespeare in the Park playing in the background. And it's in the middle of the day on a beautiful, bright, sunny day in Central Park in New York City. But you know what? This isn't a great situation for shooting portraits. There's bright overhead light, which is really harsh and very contrasty. So you have to figure out, you know what tools or what do I have available in my scene to improve that light. And that's what I do whenever I approach midday light, to figure out how can I make good portraits. I look around and see what I have available to me. So the first thing that I'm looking for, the first solution that I'd like to go to, is looking for shade. So I look around me here and I try to figure out where I could possibly stick my subject that gets them out of direct sunlight. That might be the shade of a tree. I have a bunch of trees here. It may be underneath an overhang. Some of the buildings have overhangs here. Also the side of a building. Wherever I can find shade might be a good go-to, because I get the person out of that direct sunlight, it cuts down on the contrast, and then I can build back in with reflectors to illuminate the face. So if I can get someone in the shade, that is my go-to for dealing with overhead direct midday light. The next thing I look for in my scene is natural reflectors, and that's going to be a large surface that's illuminated by the sun and is neutral colored, and I'll use that actually as the light source for my image. So it might be a concrete sidewalk. The light's hitting it, it's filling light back into the face. Maybe it's a large building, or maybe it's the side of a moving truck. Something large, neutral, and illuminated by the sun. So the first thing, as I said, you go look for shade. You want covered shade. If you can't, open shade. The next thing you do is look for natural reflectors. After that, you're figuring out, okay, what else can I look for in my scene that was going to allow me to control the light? So what you can do is, if you have to shoot in direct sunlight, you might be able to pose your subject so that the light looks good on their face. So you turn their head towards the sun, lift their chin up. If you have the right tools, then you can start to modify that light. So it might be things to block off overhead light, which could be a piece of foam core or the backside of a reflector. From there, you can use tools like diffusers and scrims and build it back in with reflectors. So what I like to do is I like to keep it simple. I like to look for open shade or covered shade. I like to look for natural reflectors, and then if I don't have those available to me, I'll shoot in the natural direct sunlight if I have to, and try to take it under control with things like reflectors and diffusers. So let's get started. I'm going to start with shade, and I'm going to end up shooting in direct sunlight, see what we can do to make flattering portraits. Before we get started today, I wanted to take a second to talk about my equipment choice, because it will make a difference in my images. I use generally on location about 4 main lenses, and the reason I select these lenses is they're all really wide apertures, which means if you look at my lenses, they're all 2.8 aperture or wider, which means they let in a lot of light, but more importantly for when I'm shooting on location, they give me a really narrow depth of field. So many of these shots, if you're seeing it on this camera, you're going to see something totally different, because you'll see all the details in the background. However, through my camera, I'm shooting at 2.8 or sometimes even 2.2, so the background goes really soft. It's a nice bokeh, a nice blur, and it makes it undistracting. And I've done that because I'm trying to teach you about light, and it keeps the background nice and simple, and it's not distracting. My recommendation to you is, if you're looking to purchase equipment, you're honestly better off purchasing a better quality lens than even a better quality camera. Once you have a good camera, the lenses make all the difference in the world. Don't purchase a lens if you can afford it that is 5.6, for example. You're better off buying something that's more like 2.8. I don't own hardly any lenses that aren't 2.8 or wider. So let me talk a little bit about the lenses I'll be using mostly today, and they're all going to give me that narrow depth of field. The first lens I want to talk about is the 85mm 1.4. 85mm is a really nice compression for a portrait lens, and the fact that I can shoot 1.4 or a really, really wide aperture allows me to have that narrow depth of field and those beautiful portraits with the beautiful backgrounds that I shoot. 85 is great if you are shooting a full frame camera. So if I have a full frame sensor and I want to shoot with a 50 for a portrait, and I move in really, really close, what tends to happen is that I distort the face. And so the face looks wider, it looks more bloated. If I can put on an 85mm, you're going to have a better level of compression, and it will simplify your background if you shoot at 2.8 or wider. This is my go-to lens for most portraits on location, most of the images I'm taking today. The next lens that I like to use is going to be my 50mm 1.4. Again, 1.4 for that same reason. It's a fast lens, a wide aperture. The reason that I choose a 50 is if I need a wider shot, so I don't have to back up really, really far. If I want a full length or a mid-length shot, I'm able to switch onto my 50 to achieve that shot, versus with an 85, I'd have to back way up. These two lenses are fixed. I like them because they're lightweight, so when I go on location, if I just have a reflector and these two lenses, a lot of times I can achieve most of the lighting and most of the effects that I want. So I keep it really simple and keep it light. Now there's two other lenses that I frequently use on location, and they're zoom lenses, which gives me a little bit more flexibility. The first lens that most people refer to as a go-to portrait lens, most portrait photographers use this lens, is a 70-200 2.8. Again, it's a wide aperture. I've mentioned 2.8 lens, and so I have 2.8 from 70mm all the way to 200. So at 70mm, I can shoot kind of a mid-length shot, and then at 200mm, it makes for absolutely beautiful headshots. So if I want really tight, really close headshots, I would be using my 70-200, closer to 200mm. Many of the shots I'd use today, if it wasn't using the 85, it was using this lens. It gives me a range so I can shoot wider or also zoom up close. The bokeh of the lens, or that nice blur in the background when shooting at 200 or a longer focal length, is very beautiful and very flattering. The last lens that sometimes I will use on location, so I have that flexibility of a zoom, is a 24-70. The 24-70 is really great if I'm doing group shots, if I'm doing kind of group portraits on location, or if I want to be able to have the ability to zoom or maybe include the environment in the shot. Again, it's 2.8, so I can shoot at a narrow depth of field. So those four lenses are going to cover the range of what I need. Usually I take two on location depending on my need, but remember, all of them are 2.8 or wider, so I can have a narrow depth of field, really focus in on the subject, and if it's a dark environment, it lets more light into the scene. As you're watching this class, something I want you to pay attention to is the backgrounds. When I'm photographing in mid-daylight or in bright sunlight, what's happening is there's bright sunlight hitting all around me. It's hitting a rock in the background, it's hitting a car, and what happens is this becomes really bright and distracting highlights. So when I'm shooting, when I'm looking through my camera, I'm not just paying attention to the light on the subject's face, I'm also paying attention to the backgrounds. Sometimes even a half an inch or a couple inches left or right is going to make all the difference from making the background being really beautiful and subtle to having really distracting highlights. So pay attention to that and be aware. Another thing, it's not even just left or right, but also height. If I stand up taller, I might be able to shoot down and simplify the background, or I can get at a low angle, maybe shoot against darker leaves on trees. If you're photographing a subject, what I will often do is I will get down at a lower angle when I'm shooting a full length. If I get down at a lower angle and back up, so I back up 10-15 feet, get at a low angle and zoom in on my subject, it makes them look taller and more slender. So you'll see that's something I frequently do. If you see me shooting something that ends up being full length, I'm usually down on my knees and back a little bit further. Remember now, when you go out and you're trying to conquer midday light, bring along fast lenses, simplify your depth of field, pay attention to your backgrounds to avoid bright highlights, and remember that angles make a difference. Some angles are more flattering to your subject, and moving your angles and direction will help you simplify your background to make a more pleasing portrait.